My name's Stephanie Buffum, and it's my pleasure to be spending the next 15 minutes with you, give or take, discussing an issue that has been on our regional agenda more and more every day. I'm going to talk about 4 primary topics this evening: the location of North American shale and gas, how it moves on land and on sea, what's at stake, and a few protection strategies in our region. Not all of them, but a few of them, just to take us into this arena. Friends of the San Juans is a nonprofit organization that was created in 1979. And we started off with community-based planning. And since that time, we've expanded into a whole host of areas, including marine research, planning, and most recently, the issue of fossil fuel transport through the Salish Sea. I want to go through 2 slides just to refresh our mind about where this product is coming from in the United States and Canada. The oil reserves in our North American continent are appearing in blue, and then we have our liquid-rich petroleum products in red, and the area in green is the Salish Sea. Keep this in the backdrop of your mind. How do you get large pools of fossil fuels into vessels, whether they're pipelines or ships, and how do you move them into various markets throughout North America, Europe, and Asia? This has been updated since it was first created by a Canadian publication that illustrates the variety and volume of ways that we transport materials, fossil fuels, primarily throughout North America. We have pipelines, we have tankers, which will be the focus of my emphasis in the next few slides. But it is a vein system, a massive vein system throughout North America that requires shipping, that requires pipeline, that requires railroad. And each one of those has a host of associated problems. This evening, we're going to be focusing our attention on things that are near and dear to us, shipping. Back in 2013, if you'll recall what most of you were doing on November 16th, many of you were probably here in Seattle expressing your concern over Gateway Pacific Coal Terminal. 4,000 of us were raising our voices and commenting in that process. Gateway Pacific Coal Terminal, if you can find number 16 on this chart, appears in the center of this illustration. That was my first gateway drug into fossil fuels, Gateway Pacific Coal Terminal. Once we finished that environmental impact scoping phase, we started to periscope up and look at the rest of the terrain in our area. And we asked ourselves, what else is going on that requires our precious resources, our staff time, to be conducting analysis, to providing public comment on. And during that process, there weren't 18 projects on, there were only 14. And over the course of the last 3 years, we've seen an order and magnitude of expansion of permits in Washington State and British Columbia that pales me at night, that keeps me awake at night, because those ships and vessels, over 12,394 of them, are going in front of my home, in front of your home. The additional capacity, if every permit that appears in this graph were to come online tomorrow, we'd be seeing an additional transiting of ships up to 5,300. These are round trips going through the Salish Sea, for a combined total of over 17,000 transits going in and out past Buoy J at the Strait of Juan de Fuca. No one else had compiled this level of data in Washington State, British Columbia, the United States, or Canada. But we did, as residents and concerned citizens out in the San Juans, with the help of many consultants. And every 2 months, we're looking at what's playing in terms of permit activity and commenting when that's necessary. This is one of the most important illustrations that I'm going to show you tonight, and there's a copy of it on our table over here with details of permit applications. I want you to consider the volume of traffic. Now let's get into the topic a little bit deeper. Oh, keep in mind, this predates the congressional crude export ban in December. So all these numbers, very conservative for the most part. Washington State had created a vessel traffic risk assessment that one of my colleagues, Fred Fellman, was heavily involved in back in 2010, 11, 12, 13, and 14 is when the final results were finally released. And looking at the volume of traffic in the Salish Sea, we were seeing some interesting trends that were showing us increases up to 43 and 48% of additional shipping traffic in our region. We were not being satisfied by the level of thoughtfulness that federal agencies were playing to the volume of traffic, not only being generated from Washington State in the United States, but also British Columbia. And that's a piece I'd also like you to be thinking about as next steps that you can be pushing your decision makers in terms of consider the volume of traffic from Canada. Because that previous slide had about 75% of that traffic not generated in US waters, but in Canadian. I like to illustrate to every audience that I speak to the number of First Nations and US tribes that depend on the Salish Sea. There are over 70 tribes, Canadian and American, that affiliate, associate, culturally derive subsistence fishing throughout the Salish Sea. This is an image borrowed from one of the canoe journeys. This was a paddle to Quinault in 2013. And it's an important piece for us always to remember. I don't know if many of you are looking at this and for the first time realizing there's a lot of tribes. Just curious, raising your hand. Does this surprise you, seeing this slide? New image for folks? The social and cultural risk of an oil spill is significant to our region, to natives and non-natives alike. It impacts our recreational areas, our foods, our medicine, our economy. The environmental risks of an oil spill in the Salish Sea are equally significant, with over 37 species of mammals, 172 birds, 300 fish, 3,000 invertebrates, 113 endangered, threatened, or species of concern, either through the United States Endangered Species Act or the Species at Risk Act in Canada. And of course, there's us, over 7 million of us. The economics of an oil spill are equally significant, with over 22 million people visiting the Salish Sea. And when I say Salish Sea, think of area north, right around Desolation Pass, Campbell River, all the way down to Olympia, Tacoma, and all the way out to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So we're talking about British Columbia, we're also talking about Washington State. 22 million people coming out here with an investment-backed expectation that they're going to see something supranational and super amazing. A major oil spill, Senator Maria Cantwell stated back in April of 2014, would have a significant impact on Washington State's maritime economy, which she estimated was worth $30 billion, supporting over 148,000 jobs. That's just Washington alone. Oh, and by the way, $15 billion in fishing, seafood, boat building, and maintenance. Let's talk a little bit about accident and oil spill risks. Now, this data is coming from our gold standard, the Vessel Traffic Risk Assessment that the Department of Ecology, the Puget Sound Partnership were shepherding through. These estimates are based on accident frequency. During this projection that was released in 2014, the overall accident frequency in our waters would increase by 18%, potential oil spill loss could increase by 68%, and this is the real big one for most of us out in the San Juan Islands. The area in red, if you know Turnpoint, Stewart Island, potential oil spill loss in Haro Strait increases by 375%. Rescue tug, first person on the scene, who's going to get there? In a tidal sequence of 4 to 6 hours, we would be feeling that in our homes in the San Juan Islands. You'd be feeling that in Seattle very quickly, depending on the climate conditions, depending on the ocean, depending on the wind. We have a lot of new risks in oil spill. Most of our preparedness is based on North Slope crude. The products that we looked at in our third slide when we were talking about new types of fuels, diluted bitumens, are much thicker. The product is one that we're not training as frequently on as we have with North Slope crude. We don't understand yet the fate and effects of diluted bitumen in a spill response area. Fortunately, the United States National Energy Board is looking at some of these issues right now, but they're not taking into account all of the data that is existing. And in response, the United States National Academy of Sciences recently released a study on the fate and effects of diluted bitumen. Unfortunately, the National Energy Board of Canada, which is reviewing Kinder Morgan, has not received that data and is refusing to take that into consideration. So you'll see that's another one of your do lists, is encourage our congressional delegates, our governor, our president, to push Canada's National Energy Board to take into consideration our best academic scientists in our country. This is an illustrative slide of incident reporting. And this slide only includes data from Canada. It's Georgia Strait Canadian data from 2004 to 2016. And it illustrates where we have our accidents and our incidents from the Canadian side. If you were to overlay this with data from the United States from 1995 to 2005, add on 1462 accidents and another 1,100 dots for incidents. Canadian data was a little easier to harvest for this slide. We're in the process of getting latitude and longitude data so that we can overlay and harmonize that with United States data. Surprising slide? It's always interesting to be seeing where our most frequent spills are happening. You can see a nice constellation up around the Fraser River in Canada. You can certainly see Turnpoint. Again, we've got a lot of existing issues in our waters, and these aren't counting the ones that are near misses. Just because today is the anniversary of the Marathusa, today it would be departing, it left Japan on the 16th of March, 2015. It would just now be setting out from Korea on its way to Vancouver into English Bay, which is what this slide illustrates. I like to tell the story of the Marathusa's maiden voyage because it represents one of our newest dry bulk carrier ships. This was its maiden voyage. It's a Panamax-sized bulk grain ship. Its statistics appear in front of you here. It's built in 2015. Its flag is Cyprus. When this vessel came into English Bay in Canada, that's when you're running on the bulkhead along Stanley Park and you look out and there's usually 19 to 20 vessels out there. The Marathusa was out there hemorrhaging approximately 3,700 liters of its bunker, of its fuel that it depends on. And it took about 3 days to sort this one out in Canada. One of our colleagues was the first on the scene, Peter Ross. And then Transport Canada and Coast Guard and a few other phone calls were made, and after 3 days, they determined that the cause of the spill was human error, and someone had hit the wrong button. It was a new vessel. I like to show this one because accidents happen. They usually happen because of human error. I don't want you to leave this conversation thinking that there's not much going on. There are a lot of important standards of care already in place. We have one of our port commissioners who sits on the Harbor Safety Committee with us, Fred Fellman. We do have some fantastic coordination going on between Canada and the United States through the Cooperative Vessel Traffic Management System. I'm not going to get too into detail with this slide. Suffice it to say that we do have traffic separation schemes already in order. We have the United States Coast Guard that is spot on when there are incidents happening out in U.S. waters. We do have some very good lines of communication. That's not to say that we can't go a little further, that we can't do a little bit better. I want to talk about a few different vehicles that are currently coming up in media in consideration for tools to deal with this. Our organization is embarking on nomination to the International Maritime Organization with a whole host of partners, other NGOs, state, local, federal government, First Nations, U.S. tribes, to elevate our area as one of the global areas of concern through what's called a particularly sensitive sea areas designation. It's based on the highest international standards of protection. Its prime goal is to be a notice to mariners that they're entering something that is super special at the global level, and it also has a host of protective measures that can be enacted and tailored to a region. There are 14 particularly sensitive sea areas in the world today. 2 are in North America, in the United States, in the Hawaiian Islands, and also in the Florida Keys. There are 3 parts to a particularly sensitive sea area. You must have ecologically, social, or cultural threats. One of those must be met in the entire area. Based on our feasibility study and our research, we're hitting all 3 strongly throughout the area. The second is you must be an area that's vulnerable to shipping. We've demonstrated that as a region. And the third is, what do you do about it? So what? And those are called these associative protective measures. And that is starting to come into play with conversations with federal, state, and tribal entities, and we'll be tailoring those concerns primarily now through June, and then finishing up a draft nomination in July. Again, a comparison of our region to the world. The Salish Sea compares very strongly, exceptionally strongly, when you look at the additional 14 PSSAs in the world. Some additional criteria that shows how we rate in terms of areas. I just want to pull out some of our Salish Sea highlights. The Fraser River and some of our state-recognized bird areas are very significant in terms of meeting criteria at global designation for a PSSA. We have our special areas, our biosphere reserves, and some of the best studied areas in the world. The PSSA proposal that we're moving forward, again, it's still in play, but think of Campbell River, again, south. This is the area that's outlined in yellow to illustrate the area that we're considering in this nomination. Again, the highlights: early warning system for mariners, increased global awareness of the area, safer shipping, increased funding for our area, for research, for science, for oil spill preparedness, and making sure our standards of care, pilotage, vessel traffic, anchorage, data reporting speed, things of that nature, are harmonized with Canada and are the most robust as they can be for our country. This is our timeline right now. We've completed our feasibility. We're in the process of soliciting feedback and participation in this process. We would like to have this in front of our President Barack Obama before he leaves office in under 300 days, and while Justin Trudeau is stepping into some trans-boundary initiatives. It's a sporty schedule. Fortunately, we've had some very significant friends. The Washington Women's Foundation has been our lead champion and sponsor, and some of those women who have been walking with us from the date we submitted are with us tonight. And my hands are up to you for making that bold investment in one of our legacy pieces for the region. What you can do. There's a lot that you can do, but I'd like you to think about these 4 things for tonight. And these are all on our table, so you can grab a cheat sheet. Sign the PSSA petition, share the video, comment. There's a lot you can comment on, but I want you to keep in mind in this fall season, you're going to have a lot of homework to be doing. We've got the Shell EIS coming out in Anacortes. You've got Gateway Pacific Coal Terminal. You've got to tell the Governor Inslee to work with our BC Premier Christy Clark to improve oil spill preparedness, and tell all of our electeds, keep that drum beating this summer. The Governor, the Department of Ecology, our senators, to push for the inclusion of the National Academy of Sciences study undiluted bitumen. And with that, my time is done. Thank you.
I'm Fred Fellerman, and I was working on, after finishing my graduate degree and got my Master's of Science in Fisheries at the UW, and then I went off to DC to find places of national significance for marine protection of some national marine sanctuary. And we nominated the Olympic Coast and the San Juan Islands and Olympic Coast with Congressman Lowry, who was then our chair of the Merchant Marine Fisheries Committee. And so we got the Olympic Coast designated, and the San Juans ended up becoming the Northwest Straits Commission and all those MRCs. On the way back, with my car in tow on the back of the U-Haul, the Nestucca barge got T-boned by its own tug off the Olympic Coast in the winter of 1988. And then there was a proposal to drill for oil off the entire Washington and Oregon coast, lease sale 132. And so with oil on the beach and a proposal to drill for oil and a marine sanctuary off the coast, the local governments there were really looking for help. So I immediately had a contract with 12 county commissioners. And I have like 5 port commissioners to work with now, but 12 county commissioners, and it worked really well. We wrote EIS comments and things like that, but my life really got changed when just the next year, this little thing called the Exxon Valdez happened. So that was 1989. So ever since then, it was like this life of mine went into a whole nother path. So I am here as the Northwest consultant for Friends of the Earth, and I've been working with them for over a decade, and really started with cruise ship issues with them, we have a whole vessel program out of San Francisco, and Friends of the Earth is like the largest network of international nonprofit NGOs that, in fact, we have a consultative seat on the IMO to deal with things like, on the Olympic Coast, we have the area to be avoided and things like that. So for this talk, it was very helpful that Stephanie set me up so well. I'm going to try to get into some of the more nerd-like things that hopefully you'll come along for the ride. But anyway, so we'll start off with a couple of pretty pictures of mine. The Salish Sea, except for the one with the humpback in Prince William Sound, I couldn't get a good humpback shot yet, although they've become much more prevalent. And I've been spending a little less time on the water for some reason. I've got this other gig that's really taking a lot of time. But anyway, so the Salish Sea is truly an oasis of wonderfulness. We all know that. And we've really been spared this remarkable frequency of events that occur around the world. In fact, we are often referred to as being really the top with the least amount of oil spills in the nation. And unfortunately, this has also been conflated to suggest that we have the best ability to respond to a spill, when in fact I would suggest they're inversely related. We have very little practice in responding to spills because we were so good at preventing them. More than that later. So this area is, as Stephanie was alluding to, is really under siege from fossil fuel projects, both from the tar sands and the coal from the east and the north, as well as the and then we have the tanker traffic coming in from Alaska, and as Alaska went down, we're having international tankers coming in. So and the second you draw a map like this, it's outdated. Projects come up, others die, but you get the sense that the volumes of traffic through this area are dynamic, and the only thing we know in the maritime world, the only constant is change. Typically, when you talk about And I got to apologize. This PowerPoint was put together with some haste. So, if I'm out of sequence or out of focus, it's only because I'm out of time. This is the typical way vessel traffic is characterized with, annual histograms of numbers of ships. So you can see to Puget Sound ports only, we have tank vessels, and it really haven't varied all that much from 547 in 2000 to 565 or 585 in 2014. The Columbia River ports have taken quite a bit more of a change, and then you can see on the right there was this involves this really new form of tanker traffic is called ATBs, which are articulated tug barges. So instead of towing a barge by a wire, you have a notch in the barge and you push it. It looks much more like a tanker. In fact, you wouldn't know it's a barge from the site. So anyway, this is the traditional way numbers of transits entering the Strait of Juan de Fuca. These data are collected by the Department of Ecology and Coast Guard. Very consistent means of measuring. However, I would suggest it's not the most informative. It's not just the number of ships that you're worried about. It's where they're going and how long they're loitering in your area. So this is from that vessel traffic risk assessment that when I sued BP up at Cherry Point in 2001, part of the settlement agreement to not stop them from using the dock was that they would conduct this study. So we've updated this now 2 other times, and we're about to update it now for 2015 data. It's 2010, and so this is using 2010 as the baseline. So getting your orientation, right? We have this orthogonal view here with entrance to the strait here where Nia Bay is. And the lines, the colors don't really matter. They're just like increments of volume. And so, but different ships travel at different speeds. And so it's the duration of time they're in the waterway. So this is just taking our focus vessels, which are the bulk carriers, the container ships, cargo other vessels, tankers, chemical carriers, barges, and these ATBs. That total number is only 25% of all the traffic that we have in the area, but the fishing boats and the ferries, all those things are not in this model, just the ones that we are concerned that really make a big noise when they go bump in the dark. And so what you can see here in this composite is that we have a couple of significant spikes. Juan de Fuca gets the collective of all the traffic that goes north and south, so of course you see that being very tall. A lot more traffic turns left. Well, actually, the traffic that turns left up to Canada is equal to the combined traffic of Seattle-Tacoma. Port of Vancouver is eating our lunch right now, and us port commissioners are not happy about. And then you can see these large spikes in Seattle and Tacoma, where obviously is their destination for a lot of our traffic. And they're also, that's where the ferry, no, these don't include the ferries, but that's where the destination for a lot of us are. So this is just a way of looking at things, and I will just wanted to orient you to that, so you'll see a couple of other ways of looking at this. So bear with me now. So looking at it in a flat plane, it would be nice if it was a higher resolution. We're just looking at here, the cargo ships on top and the tankers on the bottom. All right, so what this shows you on the top is that most of the cargo, and this is everything other than tankers. Again, Canada has more of that traffic, but in the tanker traffic, you can see it's really going along currently, Rosario Strait and down to Puget Sound. So a lot of that is bunker barges that fill the tankers up, fill the ships up. They call on Seattle and Tacoma. They get the oil from the refineries and run it up and down. But the destination from all those ships are basically going to U.S. refineries. We have 5 refineries in the state, 2 at Cherry Point, 2 at Anacortes, and 1 in Tacoma. And I'm going to be talking about the smallest refinery today, the one in Tacoma. But just for broader context, Canada, our friends to the north, are our largest provider of fuel, even though traditionally we thought our refineries were set up originally. The reason why they're put up in the backwaters of the Puget Sound or the Salish Sea is that we were all connected by pipeline. And that is only in the 70s when Alaska came online that we started receiving tankers to fill the refineries. And in fact, if you were originally to build a refinery to receive tanker oil from tankers, you'd build it in Port Angeles. You wouldn't stick it in the backwaters of the San Juan Islands. So this whole route is sort of like an afterthought and one that creates quite a bit of risk. So anyway, but Canada is the 3rd largest producer of oil it's a major force, and it's something that's going to be with us a long time. So this is just the West Coast derivative of the slide Stephanie showed you. So the big Athabasca fields up in Alberta, and the various ways they're trying to get that oil to market. The red line is the Enbridge line, which I think the natives have put a stop to. And the problem is that the yellow and brownish line, that's the Kinder Morgan line. That already exists, and that's been going on since 1950s, and they're just trying to now twin the line, but with a bigger capacity. So going from tripling the capacity from about 300,000 barrels a day to 900,000 barrels a day. That would result in, here's that line more closely, and you can see half of it splits off to Burnaby, and there's a refinery in Vancouver, and then the line connects to our 4 refineries in the North Sound, but not to the one all the way down at Tacoma. So this expansion, if it goes through, would basically result in tankers increasing from basically once a week to 1 a day. That's the 7-fold increase. And in the original proposal, and in order to get to Burnaby, it's actually quite interesting. There are 2 bridges, the first and second narrows, before you get to the terminal. This is a ridiculously tight crossing, and you can see there the pinch that it has to go through. And originally, when they proposed this project, they wanted to widen the bridge, the crossing there, so that they could bring in tankers that are bigger than are allowed to come into Puget Sound, Salish Sea. I'm an old schooler, I'm sorry. And that would be illegal based on laws that the late Senator Magnuson put in place. But the challenge of this isn't just any oil, as was mentioned. This is diluted bitumen. And so bitumen is basically molasses quality, sand-embedded tar, that in order for it to flow through a pipeline or get it in a truck or a train, it has to be diluted with this highly volatile material, condensates of sort, and it's called diluted bitumen or dilbit. And they can do it with all sorts of different properties, and the problem is that this very light material, when spilled, separates from the heavy stuff, and then the heavy stuff sinks. If it gets entrained as sand, like the Fraser River, it also will sink. So the detection methods, it's hard enough to respond to a spill at the surface. If it sinks, we have these basically, Jed Clampett means of detection, where you put a pole in the water, it says, up from the ground come a bubbling crude. And so this is the state of the science right now. And so rather challenging, technically speaking, when you have straits that are 1,000 foot deep, it's not really conducive to removing oil from the bottom. So this is a great challenge to us, and that really puts the onus on preventative measures and really quick responses. Here we go back to those wonderful maps. Now, right now on the top, we just have the amount of time oil is on the water currently, as of 2010. So it includes the oil that's in tankers as well as the cargo of ships. So basically that shows you where we're at today. Again, most of the oil going to Rosario Strait to our big refineries, and the shuttling of bunker fuel going back and forth to the Puget Sound, South Sound, and then that combined amount that goes into interest to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. If Kinder Morgan got their way and tripled the pipeline capacity, you could see not only is the volume entering the strait, in this case it would be exiting the strait because tankers would be leaving full. Not only does that significantly increase, but you can see the threat goes from Rosario Strait to a much higher volume going through Harrow Strait, making your book all the more relevant, right? So you can see this is where you get a far higher increase, and that's where that shift in risk. Again, it's not just the number of ships, but where they're going that really requires that we think about in the mitigations and response capabilities what we can do. Now, anyway, that's probably that capacity increase is every bit as big as the Keystone Pipeline. And everybody and their mother knows about the Keystone Pipeline. This is the biggest pipeline nobody ever heard about. And this is, again, because that right-of-way already exists, the twinning of it is politically pretty easy. And so, fortunately, the Tsleil-Waututh and other tribes that are really at the terminus of this thing are adamant to not let it happen. But With the Harper administration gone, we have some hopes that we'll get a revisit. And so right now it's under review. Trudeau is considering the greenhouse gas emissions on the upstream side and will engage in greater consultation with the First Nations. It didn't say stop. And when I was in an American Association of Port Association meeting back in Florida, there was a woman from Canadian Association of Ports there, and I said, so what do you think about the new Trudeau plan? And where would you put your money on the next pipeline going through? And hoping Canada East, away. And she basically said, West Coast is dead. She said, there's no way it's going to happen. And I go, from your mouth to my ears, right? So anyway, that was at least her take on it. She didn't have anything to, prove to me. And then I said, well, Quebec was making all this noise about, not wanting to see that happen. And she said, well, first of all, Quebec is a major refining center, which I didn't know. But what they were doing is previously they were taking tankers from overseas, bringing it into like Newfoundland, and then shipping it to Quebec, and through St. Lawrence Seaway, and then refining it there. So now with the Alberta fields to the west, they can reverse that line, right, and take the oil there to the refining center. And what she was saying, that the folks in Quebec were saying that we get all the risk and none of the benefits, and she thinks that's a negotiating position to say, pay up and we'll play. What I'm here to tell you, not only is that not a well-known story, and even less well-known story is the fact that we have tar sands movements right through the Salish Sea to our own refineries. So this isn't just the big bad guys going out to sea through Canada, but in fact, from the same terminal, the Kinder Morgan terminal in Burnaby, to the US refinery in Tacoma, we have seen a movement of some 1.5 million barrels in the course of, from 2010. There was a peak over there in 2012, and now we're still above where we were in 2010. And this shows the volume and the number of times it's transferred. So they make about, 25, close to 25 transfers or deliveries of this heavy sinking oil over the course of a year at around, over 1 million barrels. So where does that traffic go? And so it's just a couple of barges that do this traffic, and it's all these traditional barges, the tow wire barges. And the Sauce Brothers are the company out of Coos Bay, Oregon, who were the Nestucca barge spill that got me started in the first place, when they lost that tow wire and collided with their own ship when they tried to reattach. Now, Sauce Brothers, I'm not sure to say that they're a bad company. They've learned their lessons a lot. This is a different tank barge that crashed on the Washington coast later. But these tow wire barges are particularly vulnerable to detachment. And if you have, the sinking oil on board, it could really ruin your decade. So this is also, so we have this app, Marine Traffic. If you don't have it, you got to download it. You can look up any ship. So this is the pathway of this tug and tow between, again, you see Burnaby up in Vancouver. The route is through Rosario Strait down to Tacoma, to the U.S. oil refinery. And I've been tracking this now for months, and it's a very, like a ship, it's a bus schedule. So what are we going to do about this? Well, back in the day, we worked with Macaw and others to get the emergency response tug out at Nia Bay, and it has gotten really, the Coast Guard did millions of studies to prove that it's not necessary, and it wasn't until we got public funding, after 10 years of study, we got public funding to give it a try, and immediately it's been responding to like 55 vessels at this point, many of which were on the Canadian side. And so it's really proved itself to filling a niche where we don't have piloted yet, we don't have tug escorts yet, and language is a challenge. Anyway, and that's where ships have gone bump in the dark. So, and this is the Chairman Green with Admiral Taylor, with the Coast Guard signing an MOU with the Macaw. And the Coast Guard and the Macaw have been trying to work better together with the government-to-government relationship, but still, the Coast Guard is a tough nut to work with, and but the Macaw, I got to give their hats off to their ability to get their attention. Now, also was mentioned that while we used to receive crude oil from Alaska, there was a ban on the export of U.S. domestic crude oil. I was working with Macaw back when Clinton lifted the export ban for Alaskan oil, so now we just lifted ours. What people don't know already, we're in the business of exporting oil. So this is the total crude exports from 2010 to 2014 that have already occurred. All 5 of our refineries have done some amount of this, so they've demonstrated that the facilities, as they are currently plumbed, can move crude oil outbound, and that's where the tar sands and the Bakken shale can be. San Juans have already been exposed to drifting ships back in the day, 1997, right? And so what would I recommend to do if we had nothing else to do? We have to get this, as Stephanie mentioned, this National Academy of Science new understanding of the sinking nature of the oil. Coast Guard treats it as like any other oil. This has to be recognized and built into the contingency plan so we have faster response times, respiratory protection for the responders so they can get there fast without getting damaged from the high vapors. We need a tug like we have one in the Strait. The oil barges that moving the bitumen as well as the regular oil barges would be escorted if they were under California law. Basically, about 60% of all the barges that we have would be required to be escorted if they were subject to the same laws in California as we have here. This is a huge gap in our protection. I think the single most important thing we could do right now is to get that protection, especially for those dilbit-carrying crude barges. The tug in the San Juans will be critical to deal with all that freight traffic that Canada is doing, as well as the increased traffic of the Kinder Morgan project, but they're planning on escorting all those tankers, so we have nothing of the similar protection for the freighters. The Coast Guard right now has been very inconsistent with whether our regulations apply to ships bound to and from Canada. So if we have any hope of addressing this growing threat for ships bound to Canada, this issue of innocent passage needs to be resolved. We have to make sure Kinder Morgan does not go through. It's the single biggest threat to an oil spill in our entire region. For all those variety of projects, this is the one to kill. And ultimately, there needs to be a better way in which stakeholders and governments can discuss across the border. Right now, we have Coast Guard and Coast Guard relationships that oftentimes don't include the public. And back in '69, I've been looking for what is the best vehicle for engaging this dialogue. There's this thing called the Sea Use Council that I would love to see updated. So, while the Salish Sea has been spared those catastrophic spills, our greatest threat is still complacency. So hopefully you'll stay engaged. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. As Nan said, my name is Rob Williams. You'll see a lot of affiliations down there. I'm going to present some work that I've done with fantastic colleagues at various institutes over the last several years. I'll try to distill it into a few key take-home messages, but I just wanted to start by thanking all of you for being here. Thank Nan and Lee for the invitation, and to thank my co-authors and collaborators for their help. I put my Twitter handle there. Feel free to share anything that I'm about to present. By way of background, I'm a whale biologist. I'm a marine conservation biologist, and if I had to describe my day job or my job description, what I do is to try to identify whale habitat, critical habitat. What do the animals need? And then either use the best available science, or if it's not available, go out and do the much needed science to make sure that the whales have what they need. And so I love this image by Roger Olmos. To me, what it says is that whale habitat is not just a box on a map. And I know we have to draw boxes on maps, but they're more than that. And as one of the founding members of the killer whale recovery team in Canada, and as an advisor for NOAA's parallel process, we fought tooth and nail to make sure that when Canada defined critical habitat for resident killer whales, we said that it had to be a quiet ocean that was full of fish. It's more than just a box on a map. And we could not get the Americans to do the same. They were willing to go as far as salmon, but they kept noise out of there. They kept acoustics out of there as a primary constituent element of critical habitat for southern resident killer whales, which is silly because a whale's world is an acoustic world. And that's what I'll talk about today. Here's just a very simple schematic of a southern resident killer whale family. Each whale is calling to other members of their family. Family is everything to this species. They have the tightest social bonds of any mammal on the planet. Each family has its own unique dialect, at least one call that it makes that no one else makes. We're not really sure what they're saying, but they're probably conveying information. Certainly we can tell the individuals, so they must be able to. They're probably conveying information about location and movement, whether they found a patch of fish, probably something about their receptiveness to mating. And these are all through low-frequency calls that travel miles. So we know that a whale's world, its acoustic world, is measured on the scale of miles on a good day. Now what we're finding is that as ships transit through important habitats for whales, it shrinks the range at which those calls are audible to other members of their family. And we can do some very simple math and physics, and we've estimated that for southern resident killer whales living in Harrow Strait, on a typical day, they're losing 62% of their opportunities to communicate. On a bad day, they're losing 97% of their opportunities to communicate. And that's because, as my good friend Rose George wrote in her beautiful book, 90% of everything, 90% of everything in this room, everything we're wearing, everything we're using, was brought to us by ships. And so and those ships make noise, of course. As we look at these future projected increases in ship traffic and different kinds of ship traffic and traffic that's carrying oil as opposed to widgets, but even those ships carrying widgets contain quite a lot of oil because they have to get from here to China and back. I want us to remember we're not starting from a pristine situation that's about to get a little bit noisier. We're starting from a situation in which southern resident killer whale families are already losing 97% of their opportunities to communicate when a shipping traffic lane gets busy. So the question becomes, how much more risk are we willing to ask the whales to live with? In addition to those low-frequency social calls, killer whales also make high-frequency echolocation clicks that they use to find their preferred prey, Chinook salmon. My friend and colleague, Dr. Scott Veers, and his dad, Professor Val Veers, just published a very important paper that told us that ship noise actually extends much higher in frequency range than we ever thought. So please ask them about that during the panel discussion, because not only are we masking those social calls that they use to coordinate their behavior, we may also be masking their echolocation clicks. But even behaviorally, we're able to tell from our own studies that killer whales are losing 18 to 25% of their feeding opportunities in the presence of boats than in their absence. And that matters because they're already food limited. Salmon aren't doing very well. So noise matters because salmon matters, and those two threats are inextricably linked. One other sort of caveat, of course, though, is that if you look at this from the perspective of the fish, maybe noise is great. Got away. But maybe it got away only to be eaten by a harbor seal. And I'd like us to keep in mind as we think about ocean noise and the ecological effects, the consequences of this massive uncontrolled experiment of introducing a lot of noise in ecologically important habitats, we have absolutely no idea who the winners and losers are going to be. We know that these animals have evolved over millennia an acoustic arms race between predator and prey, and that if we mask the acoustic signals that predators use to find their prey and that prey use to avoid being eaten, someone's going to win and someone's going to lose, and I can't tell you who they are yet. But for anyone who cares about these whales, or for anyone who eats fish, or for anyone who breathes, because we get most of our oxygen from the ocean, we should care about a healthy, intact Salish Sea ecosystem, and we can't have that if we're running this massively uncontrolled experiment with noise and we don't know what the consequences are. I'll just put a slightly broader perspective on this. This is a humpback whale that's feeding. We nearly killed every humpback whale on Earth, and they're finally making a comeback to the Salish Sea. And you don't need to be a physicist or very quantitative or a biologist to know that those sounds travel miles, those low-frequency groans. And it was a January 1979 National Geographic Song of the Humpback Whale, little vinyl floppy 45. It was an old issue by the time I saw it, but that's what got me inspired to study whales in the first place. We're now shrinking their habitat again by 50, 60, 70% from the shipping noise levels in Harrow Strait as they stand now. Whales are acoustic creatures. We're visual creatures, so I'll just show you what an acoustic footprint of a ship might look like from the perspective of a humpback whale. So you can see the ship coming up along the US West Coast. You can see, gosh, that extends for 60, 80 miles, rounding the southern end of Vancouver Island. I find this fascinating. As they approach the Gulf Islands, they buffer, and then they break through. So you can see islands can be very good at blocking sound. And then look at that island in the middle of the northern Strait of Georgia, where it wraps around the island. Imagine you're a whale sitting right at that island, and you don't know which way the ship is going. You're in that echo chamber. You can imagine if you chose wrong, noise could lead to an increased ship strike risk. So those two threats are not independent either. And then as the ship enters narrow Johnstone Strait, where we had a very small diesel spill in 2007 that exposed 25% of the northern resident killer whales, it took us months to get that thing retrieved, even though it was smack dab in the middle of resident killer whale critical habitat. All of that sound then essentially becomes a bit of an echo chamber. And again, Scott kindly loaned me 2 recordings so you can hear, this is what a Washington State ferry sounds like. So if you're lucky, this is what a whale is listening to all day. If you're not so lucky, you might be listening to a container ship with a bent propeller or a bent shaft. And this is my favorite recording that Scott has ever sent me. So how much could we gain from identifying those ships and trying to quiet them? And I think let's try to end this talk and lead the panel discussion into some mitigation ideas, because Val and Scott and I have some ideas that we think could work. If you do that over and over and over and over and over and over again, this is a year in the life of a whale. You can see the ship transits on the left. If you make some simple assumptions about their source level and how much time it takes them to get through a grid cell, this is what the soundscape looks like to a whale. And you can see down in the Salish Sea, we're talking about trying to protect an area that's already extremely noisy. If you look up in the north coast of BC, there are still some pockets of inlets and fjords that are still quiet, and we've been working very hard to try to protect those. In this example, we're proposing quieter marine protected areas. So on the left-hand side, you can see Dall's porpoise distribution. You've got 2 hotspots, one off southern Vancouver Island, one off the north end of Haida Gwaii. On the right-hand side, you can see how that noise is heard by Dall's porpoise ear. On the lower left, you see the hotspots of noise, where the Dall's porpoise and the noise overlap, are all in Canadian waters of the Salish Sea. On the right-hand side, the opportunity sites, you could protect Dall's porpoise habitat by protecting an area off Haida Gwaii where there are lots of Dall's porpoise and essentially no noise. And so you wouldn't have to do anything. And it's that low-hanging fruit that I really want us to pay attention to. The The problem, of course, is that for southern resident killer whales, it's all gone. We missed the boat. So, I have a vision. If we zoom out a little bit, what looks terribly noisy to us isn't terribly noisy at a global scale. On the left is Ben Halpern's map of shipping routes globally, and you can see that what looks extreme to us is nothing compared to some of those areas in the London Channel or the English Channel, off Hong Kong. There are some really, really busy ports. And so we do have an opportunity. We don't have the luxury of giving up. We do have an opportunity to say it's not as quiet as we'd like, but it's not nearly as noisy as it's going to be if we do nothing. I also don't want us to lose sight of the fact that these southern resident killer whales are facing multiple threats. I've been talking about noise. Much of our work in the past has focused on how much salmon these whales need and how much of that salmon is being already taken by commercial fisheries and other fisheries, and how can we get the killer whales essentially a quota of their own. And my wife, Dr. Erin Ash, has been leading, I think, a really cool study to look at the health of, in this case, she's using Pacific white-sided dolphins as sort of a proxy for how a killer whale might respond. She's doing this very non-invasive sample. When the dolphins are close to the boat, you put this petri dish on a pool net pole, and as they surface to breathe, you run the petri dish through their breath and then culture it to see which bacteria and funguses and viruses are growing in the upper respiratory tract of a dolphin. And it's no different than getting a throat swab from your doctor, except you don't actually have to touch the dolphin. She's finding some tremendous critters growing in these dolphins. And what we'd like to do is to scale that work up so that we can compare what is growing in the dolphins off northern Vancouver Island in a relatively pristine or wild area compared to the more urban waters down here or the waters off Victoria where the sewage still isn't treated, or places where there might be more agricultural runoff from way too much use of antibiotics and to test for drug-resistant bacteria in these. And you need to practice the methods on common, abundant, healthy populations before you apply them to critically endangered species like southern resident killer whales. And again, that's putting in a plug for Pacific white-sided dolphins, which are starting to make a comeback to the Salish Sea. And then I've got this picture of a killer whale with its headphones on. I really want us to start talking about mitigation because these have very different implications for industry, whether you try to create incentives to replace boats, whether you ask ships to slow down through important areas, whether you ask them to avoid particularly sensitive sea areas or any other area-based management tools. But we tend to think, on this final note, I just want to tell you that it is a privilege to work on the ocean noise issue relative to things like climate change. Because with climate change, if I made a difference now, I may not see the effects. I may not live to see the effects in my lifetime. Ocean acidification, getting rid of contaminants may take decades. The beautiful thing about working with ocean noise is that if we do something now, the effects are apparent as soon as you turn off the sound source. And it's also not, let's not buy into this notion that it's an environment versus the jobs. As the European Union has started to pass regulation to say countries can sue each other if they exceed certain noise levels. There will be a market for quieter ships. And I would love to see the Pacific Northwest corner the market on building those quieter ships because the market will be there. And wouldn't it be great if our critically endangered southern resident killer whales were the poster child for a quieter ocean campaign, because it's what we do as good neighbors. And with that, I'll thank you very much.
And I'm going to ask you, if you have a question, I've been told there are microphones, which I just noticed. Please come up to the microphones, and that way everyone can hear your question. So Dave, do you want to come up? Just stand there, please. Thanks.
Dave Anderson. Is there any force of law, or how do we enforce this? If we get this new designation, what kind of teeth does it have? I mean, does it have, you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's a really complex piece. So keep in mind we're dealing with Canada and the United States, and those two jurisdictions have different bodies. I'll just use anchorages, right? For example, in the United States, the Coast Guard, we are very tidy. We have the Coast Guard that regulates our anchorages. They tell people where to park. They tell them when they're moving off their mark. In Canada, it's very different. So there are 4 distinct different harbor ports that have jurisdiction. For instance, if you're running along Stanley Park and you're looking out in English Bay, that's Port Metro Vancouver jurisdiction. As soon as your vessel starts to move or something starts to come out of it, like oil, well, now you're into a whole nother entity. Transport Canada might get the phone call, Port Metro might get the phone call. So depending on the measure that you're targeting, it gets very complicated on who has oversight. Part of PSSA is to harmonize some of that so that we're using the same data, so that we're nudging Canada, as Fred was saying, to implement standards that we're using in the United States. So it's a measure to help nudge, because our government takes a long time to do things, and we don't have time.
Can you come up, please? Thanks, Kevin. Thanks.
Kevin Campion, and thank you all for taking the time to be here tonight. It's been awesome so far. And Stephanie, is there a mechanism, or I guess any of you guys might know, in the PSSA for acoustic regulations? And is there a model of that elsewhere where there is another PSSA? Thank you.
Great question. We're creating our own reality, very tailored to what we want through the designation and nomination of a PSSA. In terms of what you're describing, that would fall under what's called an associative protective measure. And in June, when we're holding our series of workshops, we're throwing everything on the wall that we can think of, from scientific experts and shipping industry and Coast Guard, to see what we have available and ready that's going to be biologically sound, that's peer-reviewed, that's going to withstand a body cavity search at the IMO. And so, quite frankly, these gentlemen on my bookends, the good news is they're doing the work. They've been doing the work. I hope we can get something that stays. The other good news is, even if we're not quite there, say we're on the eclipse of something big, once you get that designation, it's a very dynamic process, so you can always add to it as the science is most robust and withstands. But absolutely, I'm very excited about the opportunity with that.
It's a great question, Kevin. I might just add that in Europe, they're starting to see some standards where you actually measure how loud something is and then try to meet that standard. But they're pretty fledgling, and they're very focused on low frequencies, 63 and 125 hertz in Europe. And they're very long-term averages. So I think we're just beginning to think about like how you would draw those standards beyond the normal standards that NOAA has for noise pollution. So I think we're going to have to keep thinking about it, but the good news I can offer you from this recent paper is that we do see a lot of variability in the ships that are in our waters and in terms of how loud they are. So there's, as Rob was mentioning, some very loud ones and some very quiet ones in each class of ships. So that suggests that there may be a lot of room for improvement once we define what the standards are.
Three answers for the price of one. I'm sorry about this. You ask an academic. Sorry. The other amazing thing about engaging with the International Maritime Organization is that the ocean acoustics and the whale conservation communities have been engaging with the IMO for about 10 years on this issue. So completely independent of a PSSA, which I don't fully understand yet, the IMO has already endorsed some pledges to reduce their contribution of the global marine shipping fleet to ocean ambient noise. We asked them to reduce by half over the next 10 years. They took the numbers out, but they are at least saying we'd like to reduce our contribution. They recognize that they're part of the problem. If you contrast that with, say, climate change and trying to get the oil and gas industry to say, we'd like to voluntarily reduce our CO2 emissions, we've come a long way. The other thing that makes this different than, say, CO2 emissions is that, as you know from global efforts to reduce CO2 emissions, no one wants to go first. And everyone's concerned about the one country that might not comply with those regulations. What's beautiful about the ocean noise issue is that you don't need 100% compliance. If you can get compliance from the squeaky wheel that we played, that may actually do more than trying to get everyone to reduce their noise contribution by 1 or 2 decibels. It really just is, it's a really fun problem to work on. The other thing I think Scott and Val have been a little bit modest about is that they've also found this beautiful relationship between speed and noise. And it may be that we could get a reduction of noise levels in Harrow Strait just by asking ships to slow down. So there are so many, we just have this luxury of having 3 or 4 different policy buttons that we could push to get where we want to go. 4 answers.
Then there's the commercial side. I can put on my ugly port hat. The actual, has anybody seen the Benjamin Franklin come to town? This mega ship? It carried 18,000 containers. Like our average ship that comes to town carries 8,000. So it's like 9,000 actually. So it was double, right? And now the trend in the maritime world is not that hard to forecast. I mean, it's all about money. And so you can get 18,000 containers with the same 27 crew. Why not, right? But the thing is that all these ships are new. So this is totally the future of transport. The shipping lines are consolidating. In fact, they're losing money right now. They have more capacity than they can deal with. But the future is big, right? And so what that means is, so for part of this noise exposure is how long does it, it's not just how loud it is, but do you ever get a break, right? So you could imagine 2 ships going through the waterway the noise would stay in that waterway for a longer period of time than 1 moving through. And the real driver is, of course, because it's money, is fuel savings. And so the energy efficiencies associated with better propellers, smoother hulls, it's all kind of would work towards making things quieter. And I was hoping Val was going to be able to get a hydrophone on Big Ben if it went to Vancouver. Unfortunately, it didn't. And so I don't know. It's got like the thrust of 4 747s. I mean, it's 11 cylinders. It's the mega ship. So, but I'm of the belief that it's likely that there will be some economies of scale associated with fewer big ships of modern technology than the squeaky wheels. That's at least maybe something positive into the future.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi,
please.
I'm Christina Coons, and I'm wondering if it would be beneficial to have a real-time sound monitoring system throughout the Salish Sea, and what would it take to build it? So that would be every port, every...
That's a beautiful vision. It's really, maybe a good question is how do you rebuild it? Because NOAA did pay back in 2005 to help build out some listening capabilities that started at Lime Kiln with the Whale Museum. And so we have had up to 5 locations around the Salish Sea where we have been live streaming the sound. And so I think it's about time to refund that and rethink how it works. I'd be particularly interested in thinking about how both the sighting networks, wonderfully engaged communities around on the coast here, as well as the listening networks that we've developed and the computers which monitor the sounds automatically for us as well, could play into the response to oil spills when they happen. I think knowing where those animals are is the other thing that those listening networks give us, is real-time information about where the animals are, in addition to the ships. Orcasound.net is where you can listen to these live hydrophones.
I just wanted to chime on too on our experiences with protections at the IMO. With the northern right whale, there were tailored approaches with them. When the vessel is in the presence of the whale, or if the whale is in the presence of an oncoming ship, the trigger mechanism starts. So it's not a specific area, it's a very dynamic space. And so the IMO has been nimble enough to accommodate protections based on the presence of an animal.
Just a very minor point. While we're putting in a plug for Scott to get some more funding, I would put in a plug for something like when you're driving through a school zone and it flashes your speed. And a speaker, a loudspeaker in air, so that if you want to kayak up to that or tie up your little Zodiac next to, and just kind of hover around that listening station, you can actually hear for yourself what it sounds like, what the fleet sounds like, what the distant shipping sounds like, and you can see the decibel levels on that screen. And I think it's one thing to say real-time listening when you're sitting in the comfort of your office, but what we really need to do is to reach the community of boaters who have, I think, are not doing this out of malice. They just honestly don't know that when they go full throttle, it's really, really noisy. And I think if they could hear that, that would probably be a pretty easy entry point into changing behavior.
I forgot to mention one other thing. I got distracted by Big Ben. There are programs in Vancouver that have incentives that they reduce the berthing fees if the ships participate in this program called Green Marine, where there's various different criteria, whether it be low sulfur fuels or ballast water treatment. And so it could, if we create a criteria that, noise being one potential, that you can then get a reduction in your fees. So before even a regulatory system comes in, there's financial incentives that the destination ports can do, which would be perhaps a way to get the idea started. But in terms of speeds, the ships are going to something called slow steaming. So when they're crossing the ocean, it's all about optimizing fuel consumption. So in fact, and all the ships, by the time they skate through the San Juans and stuff, have pilots on board. The problem with the Straits and the San Juans is you have a high current velocity. So it's all about how much water over the rudder. And I can't believe if they're steaming across the Pacific that they're gunning it for the last 10 miles. I mean, I think they're probably, basically doing what they think is safe speeds, but it's not slow. I mean, 16 to 18 knots through Harris Strait. I mean, I have a place on the west side of San Juan. I see this on a regular basis, and it's concerning, but I'm just wondering, maybe a knot or two, and I think what you guys said, for every knot is a decibel. So maybe in that realm, we could probably do something, but I don't expect to be able to make significant speed changes. But that may be all we need.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Fred West, and I just want to thank you all for your dedication and your persistence. You're very inspiring, your work. I had a question for Stephanie. Would you care to share with us more about your work with First Nations peoples and the kind of exchange and history that you've built up and the alliance that you have in place?
In a word, Fred, I think the keys to the kingdom are being held by First Nations right now and United States tribes in the United States. There's been so much outcry, scientific rigor, especially in Canada, gearing up for Kinder Morgan. And there's a lot of reasons because of that. Just yesterday, I was up in Terrace, up in Nisga'a territory. I was invited to present to 203 British Columbia Assembly of First Nations. Those are all the chiefs in British Columbia to talk about particularly sensitive sea areas. And Chief Rebecca Harris, who's a Powichan tribal chief over in Saanich area represented PSSA through the assembly and made a motion. And that motion was adopted yesterday by all 203 BC Assembly chiefs. They're moving fast. There's a lot of momentum, there's a lot of willingness to find common ground. And with what I'm calling the great bromance between Canada and the United States with Barack Obama and Justin Trudeau last week in DC on the 10th, transboundary was the theme. Now, granted, it was a lot of Arctic talk, and we do have someone who's been participating in the Arctic talks. Rafe, who's in the back of the room, can raise his hand and you can chat and get caught up on all things climate change. He's fresh off the dog sled and the snow and can update us on that. But there is a tremendous amount of desire with our two nations for the first time in over 20 years. So I think the time is now to be keeping this high in your letters, in your comments. There's momentum that I haven't seen in the last 25 years on these marine issues in the Salish Sea. That's more than a word, but.
I would appreciate it if any of you would address where we stand with the Kinder Morgan project, and it certainly ranked high on everyone's list. What specifically can anybody in this room do about Kinder Morgan? And perhaps you can tell us just a little bit more about what's being proposed.
So I touched upon the twinning of this line from Alberta to Burnaby is going from about 300,000 barrels a day to 890,000 barrels a day, one tanker a week to one a day. So the twinning, the right-of-way is more or less there. They have to expand to some certain places, so they still need permissions, and that's the thing that we're hoping that the First Nations will be able to keep from happening. But the fact is that it's a National Energy Board review process. Fortunately, they were kind enough to allow U.S. citizens to participate, and a lot of folks got status as commenters, which even the Canadians commented and got ignored. Friends of the Earth was the one NGO in the States, a national group, that got to be full interveners, which just meant we spent more time generating paper that they ignored. So it's been not a very satisfying process, but at the end of the day was when Trudeau came into town and said, and First Nations called nonsense. Many of the NGOs in Canada just refused to stop participating. They didn't want to be seen as having given it due diligence and then claimed that they were along for the ride. So, like I said, Trudeau says, well, we're going to relook at this process, do more consultation with the First Nations, and consider the upstream global climate change impacts. Those are the commitments that he made. I mean, if you really consider the greenhouse gas considerations of tar sand development, it's end of story. But what they're saying now is with their, SAGD, their steam-assisted development, that's supposedly not as bad. It takes tremendous amount of energy to derive this stuff. And in fact, they're losing money currently, but it takes so much money to get one of these systems flowing that they're willing to keep on losing money because the startup would be so expensive. The one thing that I'm urging folks to do, unlike the Keystone Pipeline, where there was a crossing of the border with the line that required a State Department formal engagement, this pipeline ends in Canada. So there hasn't been a direct nexus for a State Department or really U.S. direct engagement other than the fact EPA also was a commenter. But we really need political attention. Given the fact these ships are sailing through our waters, they're in U.S. waters on the way. You can't avoid being in U.S./Washington State. So this is the thing that we really need Cantwell, Murray, and the likes to be engaged in. Cantwell is very concerned about Dilbit and our inability to respond to a spill, but in terms of engaging Canada, in terms of what they're going to do associated with this proposal is something that I think we need more of a voice.
Okay. Other comments?
I'd like to kind of add a little bit on that subject, if I could. My name's Val Veers. I go with the guy in the red shirt, Scott, up there. And I wrote a letter to the National Energy Board, must have been 2 or 3 years ago, a long time ago, saying, I'm worried about noise from those ships and whatnot. And for reasons that make no sense to me, they said I could be an intervener. And I thought, wow, that's some kind of a big deal, because they wanted all the little groups that I have been supporting with my $25 to be commenters. So I thought, well, all right, we're going to make a difference here. And so I intervened. Well, that was a long time ago, and I stopped keeping the emails when I had over 500 from the National Energy Board. They still come 2 or 3 a day, but they were coming 50 a day at times. And the email didn't have any content in it, but it had a link to 1 or 10 or 50 PDFs that some other Indian group or lawyers for Indian groups or company representative had put into this monumental process that the National Energy Board has been running and still continues to at some level. Anyway, that's kind of the context. And after a while, I thought, well, I've got to say something because they have these dates. So I wrote up what I thought was a pretty good piece about underwater noise and ship traffic, and some suggestions on how they might put ships in convoys so that they could put a rescue tug or a transport tug with a convoy and group. It's kind of what Fred was talking about with Big Bend, group the ships together, because right now there's about 30% of the time when you don't hear a ship in the Haro Strait. And if you start thinking about it from a safety point of view, you might say, well, the best thing safety-wise is put the new ship in the quiet period, because it'll be further away from the other ships. But my thought was, maybe not. Maybe you could put the ships close together and have a tug that would help them if they got into trouble and keep the quiet parts quiet. Anyway, I don't want to take time. Ideas like that. So how did it work? When I shoved that into Ottawa, and then days go by and emails fly around. Well, we've sent this out and we've reviewed it and so on, and you should talk to the Port of Vancouver. We have nothing to say, we can say nothing about the ships that transport this dilbit. We are just a pipeline company taking it from A to B. So my question for the panel or for the commissioner is, how much control does the Port of Vancouver or the Port of Seattle have in telling companies that we will deal with you if you meet our conditions? I thought it was a cool idea, Fred, you just presented. Fred always has very quick and cool ideas, which is a wonderful thing at all times, especially with him as a port commissioner here. So make it cheaper for them, because that would be within your port authority. But do you also have the ability, or does the board at the port here, or perhaps in Vancouver, have the ability to say to Maersk or one of the big shipping companies, you simply can't bring that vessel in here because it's not double-hulled, it's not escorted, it's got the wrong ballast water, or it's making too much noise? Do you have those kind of powers?
Thank you,
Port
Val.
Metro Vancouver has authority within their jurisdictional area, so like the crossings through the Second Narrows, there is this role for the port in Canada. For the most part, vessels in transit, that's Canadian, that's Coast Guard, and we have a vessel traffic agreement. It's actually a treaty between US and Canada specifically for the Salish Sea. The stuff I was talking about is really kind of a voluntary thing. We'll give you a break if you do this. And typically those those incentives have to be very big in order to affect behavior. Like I said, I think the biggest driving force we have is the economies of scale and the efficiencies of cheaper fuel savings. The regulatory environment is really, the Coast Guards are really, unfortunately say, the least common denominator is the international standards. And it really takes the states and the more local jurisdictions to have more influence. But when a vessel is underway, it's really very difficult for a port jurisdiction to have influence. It's really mostly the Coast Guard when it's underway, and it's the states if it spills. And that's where most of the leverage lies.
Thank you. Rob.
I think getting back to Nan's question, which was specifically about the Kinder Morgan pipeline, I think that's a great example, Val, that under our last administration in Canada, we had a National Energy Board review process that was extremely fragmented. It was siloed. It was each component had blinders on, and no one was allowed to look at the whole picture. The pipeline risk assessments were reviewed independently of tanker risk assessments. Port movements were completely out of that. I think there's some good news here in the sense that Stephanie has said our new Prime Minister is reopening that discussion. Presumably that there is a constitutional duty to consult. So we'll have another opportunity to consult on the Kinder Morgan process. I've learned two things about how to consult on a massive industrial proposal like that. One is that the proponent is not obliged to respond to letters that say, I'm opposed to this for emotional reasons, or this is my home and I don't want to risk it. Value judgments. They're not legally required to respond to those. And even if it's 1,000,000 to 1 votes, it's not a democracy. Submitting technical comments, they are legally obliged to respond to those technical concerns. You've underestimated the risk. You've missed this point. You don't know how dilbit behaves in salt water. I mean, these really major oversights, they are obliged to respond to those. And it's just unfortunate that the scope of the assessment a few years ago was insufficiently broad. So I would suggest that to anyone commenting on the next round of consultation, to keep your comments consistent with the scope and the terms of reference of that National Energy Board review. The other is that we have to learn a lesson from the Deepwater Horizon, which is that for decades, proponents have been submitting environmental impact statements or risk assessments that are based on average case scenarios. That on average, a ship spilling oil will encounter this many whales. We learned from the Deepwater Horizon that our environmental risk assessments ought to include worst case scenarios. If a southern resident killer whale, God forbid, were exposed to oil, we wouldn't lose one, we would lose one family. More likely we would lose 2 families, and if we lost all 3, we'd lose the population. And so this trivial diesel spill that we had in Robson Bight in 2007 that exposed 25% of the oil of the whales to oil, if that same spill had happened in Harrow Strait in August, we could easily have lost 2/3 of the southern resident killer whale population, which would doom them to extinction. We also found during the Deepwater Horizon exercise that Time and Newsweek were writing articles saying, you silly environmentalists have exaggerated the environmental impacts of this spill. And so my colleagues and I did an analysis that found that for every dead body we found on the beach of a whale or a dolphin, we were missing 50 to 250. And I think that's the scale at which environmental impact statements are underestimating the risk when they base their efforts on average case scenarios instead of considering the worst case scenario or considering the fact that we don't even know if dilbit is going to sink or swim.
Great, thank you. I think there's time for one more question, and I think you have it.
On the noise issue, I'm wondering to what extent is recreational boating a contributor, especially in the summer? You've talked mainly about commercial, and the bigger ships and the faster they go, it seems to be the dominant issue, the ferry versus the bent cargo ship. And then if I can sneak one in on the materials issue, it'll be, does the proposal to build a methanol plant in Tacoma present any new and different issues or risks versus what's already being carried?
Thanks, Mike.
Do you want to start with that? Talk about, just say a little bit about something.
Yeah, in terms of the small boats, we've got to separate the two issues. One is the contribution to the soundscape, and the reality is that small boats generally aren't contributing a whole lot to the ambient noise levels of the Salish Sea as a whole. But if that sound follows whales around from dawn to dusk every day in the summer, from a whale's perspective, it can be a contributing, a major source of their local acoustic soundscape. And our research is showing that we've done one study on northern residents, one on southern residents, and from small boat traffic within a few hundred meters, whales are spending 18 or 25% less time feeding in the presence of those small boats than they are in the absence of the boats. I'm not saying they're the biggest part of the problem, but they're certainly one of the factors that we need to consider.
I would just add to that it's pretty clear that boats and ships have about the same source level. They're about the same loudness when you're up close to them. But from a whale's perspective, usually the boats are much closer. That said, boats often are moving a lot faster than the ships. So if you listen to Lime Kiln hydrophone live for a couple of days in the summer, you'll hear a ship go by every hour, and you'll hear lots of little boats go by. Each boat will go by in a couple minutes. Each ship will take 40. And so, and they both sound about the same to a killer whale swimming past Lime Kiln State Park. So in assessing the impacts on the animals, it all depends on how close the boat is in terms of the acoustic impacts. But in terms of the duration, if it's a whale watch vessel that's with the whales all day, then it may actually have a higher impact than a ship passing by just once an hour. But if it's a passing boat, like a recreational vessel, it's probably almost insignificant because they just zoom by and are gone like a mosquito flying by your ear. So it's going to be very case dependent, I think.
Thank you. Fred, do you want to take the methanol plant?
Well, you know, Port of Seattle and Port of Tacoma formed an alliance called the Northwest Seaport Alliance, and it only deals with our container terminals. So I am so glad that the methanol plant is not part of our joint alliance. So I don't really want to answer that question. No, no. In fact, you know, it was such a nightmare. In fact, we take some pleasure. I wasn't. I mean, it helped me get elected was the Shell oil rig, right? And so this is their rig, right? You know, this is like, so just when you think you can ignore the public, wake up, you know? And so Port of Tacoma's got a real egg on their face. That is probably not happening anytime soon, but what's going on in Anacortes right now with the Tesoro refinery, they want to be exporting xylene. And that process is actively underway. EIS is kicking off. And so we're looking at increasing exports. And so anytime, I think with that project, it was over 100 additional ships outbound. So all the risk assessment work that's been done to date mostly assumes for US bound ships, for tank vessels, inbound full, outbound empty. Now that whole model has to change with the lifting of the export ban. We're going to having inbound full, outbound full, right? And so this is just one more example of that. So our risk exposure is going to increase just because if you do have an accident, risk is, you know, probability times consequence. So the more ships you put on the water, the more probability, but if it's full of oil, obviously the consequence is going to be that greater. So our risk curve is definitely going up. The one other thing I wanted to mention, because a lot of people, if you've heard like the state talk about this, the number of crude oil tankers coming to our waters has gone down. And that's because we're getting oil from the expanded pipeline and crude by rail. So they say, look, our risk is going down, so don't worry, be happy. We have to worry about Eastern Washington train derailments. That's where all the money is going, quite frankly. And that's not that it's badly spent, it's just that you're being diverted from an issue. More and more of the oil that's coming inbound is coming in on smaller ships, like these ATBs. So what you'll see is while the volume coming in is down, the number of transits are up. So probability, again, there's greater frequency of transits, although each ship is carrying less amount of oil. Fact of the matter is, even a small tanker can ruin your decade. So I'm not, quite frankly, once you get over a certain amount, I don't really care whether it's a medium-sized tanker or a super tanker. They're both going to, you're not going to rupture all the hulls, but just remember, even if the volume is down, ship traffic is up.
Thank you. I know that there's another question or two out here, but it's 5 after 9. I want to honor the fact that we said we would wrap this up at 9 because I know there's some people who came from as far away as Whidbey Island, want to get home tonight. I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists. It occurs to me that we have something like 100, I did the math, 4 times 30 more or less, years of experience and caring for this place that we live in, represented by the 4 people who are sitting up here. And I really want to thank them for being here tonight, for taking the time from their very busy schedules. I want to thank you for coming to listen to them. I hope it's been interesting and educational. I hope everybody leaves this session with one idea of something that you're going to do, because that's how all of the things that we've been talking about will be changed. And I, for one, have great confidence that they can be changed, as sort of overwhelming as they can sometimes seem. So thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Rob, Fred, Stephanie, and Scott. Thank you.